The airshow was about to start. Inside the hangar, a $30 million F-16 fighter jet sat completely silent. The best engineers on base had been trying for hours to fix it, but nothing worked. Then, from the shadows near the tool racks, a 72-year-old man in a faded maintenance uniform quietly stepped forward. The lead engineer dismissed him immediately. "We don't need the janitor right now." What nobody on that base knew was that Walter had spent 22 years as a Navy aviation mechanic. And what happened in the next 5 minutes would prove that some skills never fade. Before we dive in, tell us in comments where in the world you are watching from. Outside the base gates, thousands of families were gathering for the annual Veterans Day airshow. Children pointed excitedly at the empty sky, waiting for the jets to appear. Vendors were setting up their food stands, and colorful banners waved gently in the morning breeze. The show was set to begin in just 3 hours, and the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Inside the flight line, however, everything was falling apart. The F-16 fighter jet, the main attraction everyone had come to see, sat completely silent on the tarmac. Engineers surrounded the aircraft, their faces dripping with sweat as they frantically checked laptops and ran diagnostics. They had tried everything, but the jet refused to start. The base commander stood nearby with his phone pressed against his ear, his voice rising with desperation. "We cannot cancel this event. The governor is already here. The media has cameras everywhere. We made a promise to these families." The panic was spreading through the hangar like wildfire. And then, from the shadows near the tool storage area, an old man in a faded maintenance uniform stood watching quietly. His name was Walter Hayes, and he was 72 years old. He spent his days organizing tools and mopping hangar floors. Nobody ever really noticed him anymore. But at that moment, his eyes were fixed on the silent jet, and something in his weathered, knowing face suggested he understood exactly what was wrong. Walter Hayes had been working on this base for 12 years as a maintenance assistant. He was the man who returned tools to their proper racks, swept the hangar floors, and kept the supply closets organized. Everyone recognized his face when they passed him in the hallways, but almost nobody knew his name. He arrived every morning at 5 o'clock, left promptly at 2 in the afternoon, and rarely said more than a few words to anyone. The younger staff members simply thought of him as the old janitor, if they thought of him at all. But Walter hadn't always been invisible. In 1975, on the deck of the USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier in the South China Sea, a younger Walter Hayes worked in Navy coveralls, with his arms buried deep inside the engine of an F-4 Phantom jet. He shouted orders over the deafening roar of jet engines, directing his crew with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He was an aviation machinist's mate, one of the elite crew members responsible for keeping carrier-based fighter jets operational even in the most dangerous combat zones. Years later, in 1982, Walter's hands moved with surgical precision as he troubleshot a complex hydraulic failure that had grounded an entire squadron. His commanding officer stood nearby, watching him work, and said to another officer, "Hayes can hear what's wrong with these birds before the instruments even know there's a problem." Walter served 22 years in the Navy. He earned the Navy Achievement Medal and several commendations. When he retired quietly in 1997, he thought his days of working on jets were over. Now, back in the present, that same man organized wrenches and mopped floors. He had never mentioned his past to anyone at the base because, frankly, no one had ever asked. And if he was being honest with himself, he didn't think it mattered anymore. In his small apartment off base, there was only one framed photograph on the wall, a picture of him standing on a carrier deck with his crew, all of them young and proud and covered in grease. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, as Walter stood in the shadows watching the engineers panic around the silent F-16, something deep inside him began to stir. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ego. It was just the old instinct, still alive after all these years. He listened carefully to the failed engine attempts, and recognition flickered across his face. He knew that sound. He had heard it before. The clock was ticking mercilessly. 2 hours and 30 minutes until showtime. Marcus Chen, the lead engineer, was 29 years old and had graduated top of his class from Georgia Tech. Right now, though, none of that mattered because he was losing control of the situation. His team had already replaced the starter motor, checked every fuel line, and rebooted the avionics system twice. Nothing worked. The diagnostic computer just kept flashing the same maddening message, "Unknown fault." The base commander stormed into the hangar, his face red with frustration. "I don't care what the computer says," he barked at Marcus. "Just fix it." Marcus turned to his team, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Run the electrical diagnostic again. Check every single connection. Move!" His hands were shaking. The stress was suffocating everyone in that hangar. Then, from the corner near the tool racks, Walter quietly began walking toward the jet. He was holding nothing but a small flashlight and a cleaning rag. He approached slowly and respectfully, just watching the aircraft with careful eyes. One of the younger technicians noticed him first. "Hey, Walter, we're kind of in the middle of something here." Walter nodded but didn't leave. Instead, he moved a little closer, his gaze fixed on the landing gear area. Marcus spotted him and called out, his voice tight with frustration. "Walter, seriously, man, not now. We need space to work." "I just want to look for a second," Walter said quietly. Marcus let out an exasperated breath. "Look at what?" "You organize tools. This is a $30 million fighter jet with fly-by-wire systems. Unless you have an engineering degree I don't know about, please, just go back to the supply room." The other engineers didn't even glance up. They were too buried in their stress and their screens. Walter stood there for a long moment, then said softly, "I heard the engine try to turn earlier. It sounded like the starter relay might be—" Marcus cut him off, his voice rising. "The starter relay is fine. We already checked it. The computer cleared it. I appreciate you trying to help, but you don't understand how these systems work." Walter didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and started to turn away. But then he stopped. Something made him turn back around. Against every instinct telling him to stay quiet, to remain invisible, to just go back to his corner and let the young engineers handle it. Walter walked directly toward the jet's nose landing gear. He knelt down on the cold concrete and began inspecting a small access panel that no one else had opened. Marcus's patience snapped. "Walter, you can't just touch the aircraft. You're not authorized." A senior technician named Garcia stepped forward cautiously. "Marcus, maybe we should—" "No," Marcus interrupted sharply. "Absolutely not. If something gets damaged by unqualified hands, it's on us. Walter, I'm asking you nicely. Step away from the jet." But Walter didn't move. His weathered hand remained on the small panel, his eyes focused and calm. Someone in the background muttered nervously, "Should we call security?" Garcia, who was older than most of the team and had seen enough to know better, quietly pulled out his phone. He didn't call security. He called the maintenance supervisor instead. Chief Rodriguez arrived at the hangar within minutes of Garcia's call. He was in his 50s, had been working on this base for 30 years, and he knew things that the younger generation of engineers didn't. He walked straight up to Marcus with a calm, measured stride. "What's going on here?" Rodriguez asked. Marcus threw his hands up in exasperation. "Walter won't leave the jet alone. We're trying to work and he's just—" Rodriguez held up one hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. He turned his attention to Walter, who was still kneeling quietly by the landing gear, and asked in a calm, steady voice, "Walter, you see something?" Walter didn't look up from the panel. "Starter relay. Secondary contact. Probably corroded." Rodriguez nodded slowly, processing the information. Then he turned back to Marcus and said simply, Let him look. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. Chief, with all due respect, he's not qualified to... Rodriguez's voice dropped lower, firm and quiet, leaving no room for argument. Let him look. The entire hangar went silent. Marcus stepped back, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. But he didn't dare argue with the chief maintenance supervisor. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn multi-tool that looked like it had been with him for decades. He opened the small access panel carefully, shined his flashlight inside, and reached in with steady hands. A moment later, he pulled his hand back out. His fingers were covered in green corrosion. He held his hand up so Rodriguez could see. Rodriguez cursed under his breath. The backup relay. Marcus blinked. What backup relay? That's not showing up anywhere in the diagnostic system, because it's a mechanical fail-safe from the 1980s, Rodriguez explained. The computer can't read it. If it's corroded, the starter won't engage, but the system still thinks everything's fine. Marcus looked completely stunned. How did he know to check there? Rodriguez glanced at Walter, then back at Marcus. Because he's done this before. Walter stood up slowly, wiped his hands on his rag, and said quietly to Rodriguez, "Need to bypass it or replace the contact. 5-minute fix." Rodriguez asked, "Can you do it?" Walter nodded. Marcus was still trying to process what was happening. "Wait, how does he even—" Rodriguez interrupted him. Walter was a Navy aviation mechanic for 22 years, worked on F-4 Phantoms and early F-14 Tomcats on aircraft carriers. If he says it's the relay, it's the relay. The younger engineers standing nearby stared at Walter in shock. One of them whispered to another, "He was in the Navy?" None of them had known. Not a single one. Walter knelt back down beside the jet, and this time he had his toolbox with him, a battered metal box covered in faded military unit stickers from decades past. He opened it carefully, almost reverently. Inside, the tools were perfectly organized, old but pristine, each one placed with exact precision in its designated spot. He pulled out a small wire brush, a can of contact cleaner spray, and a replacement relay contact that he had kept in his own personal storage. He had always kept spare parts from old jets, just in case. Old habits from his Navy days had never really left him. Marcus stood nearby, silent now, watching as Walter worked with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this exact task 1,000 times before. His hands moved without any hesitation, disconnecting the corroded contact, carefully cleaning the connection point, then installing the replacement piece. There was no wasted movement, no second-guessing, just smooth, practiced competence. One of the younger engineers, Private Daniels, leaned over to Garcia and whispered, "How does he just know where everything is?" Garcia smiled slightly. "Muscle memory. You work on these birds for 20 years. You don't forget." Walter finished the repair in exactly 4 minutes. He closed the access panel, stood up slowly, and wiped his hands on his rag. Then he looked at Rodriguez and said simply, "Try it now." Rodriguez nodded and signaled to Marcus. "Start the sequence." Marcus hesitated for just a moment, then climbed into the cockpit. His hand hovered over the ignition switch. He took a breath and flipped it. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but silence. The entire hangar seemed to hold its breath. Then, a whine. Low at first, then building. The turbine began to spool up, and suddenly the F-16's engine roared to life, clean and perfect and powerful. The sound echoed through the hangar like thunder, shaking the walls and filling every corner with its triumphant roar. The entire crew erupted in celebration. Engineers cheered, technicians clapped and hugged each other. Even the base commander, who had been watching tensely from across the hangar, exhaled deeply in relief and gave an enthusiastic thumbs up toward the jet. Marcus climbed down from the cockpit, his face flushed with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He walked directly over to Walter and stood there for a moment, not quite knowing what to say. Finally, he spoke quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I shouldn't have dismissed you like that." Walter shook his head gently. "You didn't know because I never said anything. You did everything right with what you had. Sometimes these old birds just have old problems that the new computers can't see." Marcus extended his hand. Walter shook it firmly. The base commander walked over, still grinning with relief. "Walter, I owe you one hell of a thank you. You just saved this base from a complete PR nightmare." Walter just nodded humbly. "Just glad she's running again, sir." Meanwhile, Private Daniels had pulled out his phone and quickly typed Walter's name into a search engine. Within seconds, he found publicly available military service records. Aviation Machinist's Mate First Class Walter Hayes, USS Kitty Hawk, 22 years of service, multiple commendations for exceptional performance under pressure. There was even an old photograph, young Walter standing on a carrier deck, surrounded by his crew, all of them covered in grease and grinning proudly at the camera. Daniel showed the screen to the other engineers gathered around him. They all stared at the photo, then looked back at Walter standing quietly near the jet, wiping oil off his hands. One of them whispered in awe, "He was one of the best." The airshow began right on time. Outside the base, thousands of families erupted in cheers as the F-16 screamed overhead in perfect formation, its engine roaring beautifully against the clear blue sky. Inside the hangar, the chaos had finally settled into quiet relief. The crisis was over. Walter was packing up his toolbox slowly, getting ready to return to his usual routine, when Marcus walked over and stopped him. "Walter, wait. Can I ask you something?" Walter turned around and looked at him. Marcus hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone? About your service, your experience with these jets?" Walter thought about it for a moment, then answered honestly. "Because it didn't seem important. I did my job back then. I do my job now. Doesn't really matter what the job is, as long as it's done right." Marcus nodded, but he wasn't quite ready to let it go. Would you be willing to teach us about the old systems, the mechanical stuff the computers can't see?" Walter looked genuinely surprised. "You want me to teach you?" "Yeah," Marcus said earnestly. "We're good with the new technology, but there's a whole layer of these aircraft we don't understand. And if something like this happens again..." He trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Walter considered the offer, then allowed himself a small smile, the first real smile anyone on the base had ever seen from him. "All right. I can do that." Chief Rodriguez walked over, grinning from ear to ear. "I'm making it official, Walter. You're now a technical consultant for the flight line. Same pay as before, but you'll be working directly with the engineers whenever we need old-school expertise." Walter blinked, caught completely off guard. "Chief, I'm just the tool guy." Rodriguez shook his head firmly. "Not anymore." Later that afternoon, as Walter walked slowly toward his pickup truck in the parking lot, Private Daniels jogged up behind him, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Hayes, I just want to say thank you, and I'm sorry we didn't see you before." Walter stopped and put a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. "You see me now. That's what matters." As Walter drove off the base and headed home, the F-16 roared overhead once more, performing a perfect victory roll for the cheering crowd below. Walter glanced up through his windshield for just a second, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a small, private moment of pride. He had helped that bird fly again, just like the old days. Walter Hayes never asked for recognition. He never demanded respect or flaunted his decades of service to his country. He simply showed up every day, organized tools, swept floors, and lived quietly in the margins of a world that had forgotten what he once was. But on the day the engines fell silent and panic spread through the hangar, Walter did what he had always done. He stepped forward and fixed what was broken, not because he wanted applause, not because he needed validation, but because somewhere deep inside him, the instinct to serve had never left. The engineers learned something that day that no textbook could ever teach them. They learned that wisdom doesn't always come with credentials, that experience doesn't need a spotlight, and that the most valuable people are often the ones we walk past every day without truly seeing. Walter didn't need a fancy title to prove his worth. He just needed someone to trust him enough to let him do what he had always done best. Somewhere tonight, a fighter jet is flying because a 72-year-old man refused to stay invisible. And somewhere, a young engineer is learning that respect isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about who listens. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because every veteran has a story worth telling. And every story deserves to be seen.